Once upon a time, in a big and beautiful kingdom, there lived a kind and handsome prince named Daniel. He was the only child of King Henry and Queen Isabella, who loved him dearly. Prince Daniel had everything anyone could wish for: wealth, power, and charm. But there was one problem. He was not happy. Daniel was the pride of his kingdom. Tall, handsome, and with a smile that could melt hearts, he was loved by everyone. But there was one problem. His parents, the king and queen, were desperate for him to get married. "Daniel, you are 28 years old," his mother said one morning during breakfast. "You need a wife. The people are expecting a queen by your side." The king, a man of few words, nodded in agreement. "It is time to settle down, my son. As the heir to the throne, you need a family to continue the royal line." Daniel sighed. Every day, noble families sent their daughters to the palace, hoping one of them would become his wife. These women were beautiful and well-dressed, but Daniel felt something was missing. He knew they loved his title as a prince, not who he truly was. "Father, mother," Daniel said one day, "I can't marry someone who only cares about my wealth. I need someone who loves me, for me." His parents were confused. "What do you mean, Daniel?" his father asked. "There are so many fine ladies in the kingdom. Choose one." Daniel shook his head. "It's not that easy, father. If they know I'm a prince, they will pretend to be kind and perfect. How will I know their real hearts?" The queen was worried. "What do you want to do, my son?" she asked. "I have a plan," Daniel said. "I will leave the palace and disguise myself as a poor man. I will live like a commoner and find a woman who loves me for who I am, not my title." The king and queen were shocked. "What?" they said together. "You, the prince of this great kingdom, living as a poor man? Impossible. Please let me do this," Daniel begged. "I need to find true love." After much arguing, his parents finally agreed, but they gave him a condition. "You have 1 year," the king said firmly. "If you don't find a wife by then, we will choose a bride for you." Daniel agreed. He was excited about his plan. For the next few weeks, he prepared to leave the palace. He cut his royal hair short, wore old clothes, and practiced speaking like a villager. Finally, he was ready. Early one morning, before anyone in the palace was awake, Daniel left with nothing but a small bag of clothes. "I will find her," he whispered to himself. "Someone who will love me for who I really am." Prince Daniel traveled far from the palace until he reached a small village called Umurba. It was a quiet place, surrounded by palm trees and farmlands. The people were simple, hard-working, and friendly. It was the perfect place for Daniel to begin his new life. As he entered the village, he noticed a group of men tapping palm trees for wine. They climbed the tall trees with ease, cutting the stems to collect the fresh, sweet liquid in hollow calabashes. Daniel stopped to watch them, fascinated by their skill and precision. He stood there for several minutes, taking in the sight of the men moving with agility and purpose. The sound of the tapping and the trickle of the palm sap caught his attention in a way he hadn't expected. Something about the simplicity and rhythm of their work drew him in. "This is it," Daniel thought to himself. "This is what I will do here. I will be a palm wine tapper." Determined, Daniel approached one of the tappers. "Good afternoon," he greeted politely. One of the men, an older fellow with a friendly smile, looked up from his work. "Good afternoon, young man. Who are you and what brings you here?" "My name is Daniel," he said, avoiding any mention of his royal background. "I'm looking for work. I want to learn how to tap palm wine." The man chuckled. "Are you sure, my boy? Palm wine tapping is not an easy job. It takes strength and skill." "I'm willing to learn," Daniel replied. "Please give me a chance." The older man nodded. "All right then. My name is Papa Obina. I've been tapping palm wine for over 30 years. If you're serious, come to my house tomorrow morning and I'll teach you." "Thank you, Papa Obina," Daniel said gratefully. That night, Daniel stayed in a small hut he rented at the edge of the village. It was a far cry from the luxury of the palace, but he didn't mind. He was determined to live like an ordinary man. The next morning, Daniel arrived at Papa Obina's house, ready to begin his training. The old man handed him a small sharp knife and showed him how to climb the palm tree using a rope tied around his waist and feet. "Be careful, Daniel," Papa Obina warned. "One wrong move and you could fall." Daniel nodded, wiping the sweat off his forehead. The climb was harder than he expected, but he pushed himself. By midday, he managed to cut his first stem and collect a small amount of palm wine. "Well done, my boy," Papa Obina said, clapping him on the back. "You're a quick learner." Over the next few weeks, Daniel worked hard, tapping palm wine and selling it in the village. Though the job was tough, he found joy in the art. He loved the peaceful mornings, the physical effort of climbing, and the satisfaction of collecting the sweet wine. The villagers began to notice him and soon gave him a nickname: Daniel the Tapper. Despite his humble appearance, Daniel's kind heart and cheerful attitude made him popular among the villagers. He would help the elderly carry their goods, play with the children, and share stories with the men at the palm wine joint in the evenings. But while many villagers liked him, some mocked him. "Look at him," one woman said. "A young man like that should be aiming higher. Instead, he's climbing trees like an animal." Daniel laughed it off, knowing they didn't understand his true purpose. He was not here to impress anyone. He was here to find someone who would love him for who he truly was. One evening, as Daniel sat under a tree sipping palm wine with Papa Obina, he asked, "Papa, what are the women in this village like?" Papa Obina chuckled. "Women, eh? Well, we have all kinds. Kind ones, hard-working ones, lazy ones, and some who are just looking for money." Daniel smiled. "How can you tell who is real and who isn't?" "Ah, my boy," Papa Obina said, stroking his beard. "Watch how they treat people who can do nothing for them. That's how you'll know who has a good heart." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. He had much to learn, but he was willing to wait. Somewhere in this village, he believed, was the woman he was looking for. As the days passed, Daniel became more familiar with life in Umuoba. He worked hard with Papa Obina during the day, climbing palm trees and collecting fresh wine, and in the evenings, he spent time in the village square, listening to stories and laughing with the locals. He was determined to find someone special, a woman who would love him for who he was, not for what he owned. But his search was not easy. One afternoon, Daniel approached a young woman at the market. She was selling yams and looked friendly enough, so he decided to start a conversation. "Good day," he said with a warm smile. "You have fine yams here. What's your name?" The woman glanced at him and smirked. "Thank you," she said. "My name is Amaka." "I'm Daniel," he introduced himself. "I'm new to the village and work as a palm wine tapper. It's hard work, but I enjoy it." Amaka's smile disappeared, and she raised an eyebrow. "A palm wine tapper?" she repeated, her tone filled with disbelief. "Is that all you do? I only agreed to spare you my time and talk to you because you are handsome, but handsome or not, I can't eat your face. That will not put food on the table, you know. So if you are planning to ask me out, I will advise you to think again." Daniel felt a sting of embarrassment but remained polite. "It's honest work," he said. "I may not have much now, but I work hard." Amaka shook her head, laughing. "Good luck with that," she said. "If you're looking for a wife, try someone who doesn't care about eating every day." Another time, Daniel met a woman named Ifeoma at the village stream. She was fetching water, and Daniel offered to help carry her bucket. "Thank you," Ifeoma said, letting him lift the heavy load. "You're quite strong." Daniel smiled. "It's the work I do. I climb palm trees every day to tap wine." Ifeoma paused and looked at him carefully. "You're a palm wine tapper?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel replied. "It's an art, really. I love the rhythm of the work and the sweetness of the wine." Ifeoma said, her voice turning cold. "It's good that you love it because I don't think many women would love a man who does such work." Her words hit him harder than he expected. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked. "Simple," she said. "You don't have much to offer. Your niceness won't build a house or provide food." Daniel stayed silent, letting Ifeoma walk away. It wasn't the first time he'd heard such comments. But it didn't stop him from hoping. Somewhere in the village, he believed, there had to be someone different. After a month in the village, Daniel had settled into his new life as a palm wine tapper. The villagers had grown used to seeing him climb the tall palm trees every morning and carry his containers of fresh wine to the market. Although he earned little, he was content, finding joy in the simple routine. One day, as Daniel was walking back from the palm trees, he saw a young woman by the riverbank. She was washing clothes and humming a soft tune. She wore a simple wrapper, her hair tied back neatly, and though she wasn't dressed in fine clothes, she had an air of grace and quiet strength. "Curious?" Daniel approached her. "Good afternoon," he greeted. The young woman looked up and smiled shyly. "Good afternoon." "I don't think I've seen you around before," Daniel said, sitting on a nearby rock. "Do you live in this village?" "Yes," she replied. "My name is Jane. I live with my aunt and cousin on the other side of the market." Daniel nodded, noticing how her hands were rough from hard work, yet her eyes were warm and kind. "I'm Daniel," he said. "I'm a palm wine tapper." Jane laughed softly. "I've heard about you. People call you Daniel the handsome tapper." Daniel grinned. "Yes, that's me. And you? Do you work at the market?" Jane shook her head. "No, I spend most of my time at home, cooking, cleaning, and doing chores for my aunt and cousin." Daniel frowned. "That sounds like a lot of work. Don't they help you?" Jane hesitated, then said, "My aunt is old, and my cousin, well, she doesn't like housework." Daniel could see there was more to the story, but he didn't press her. Instead, he offered to help her carry the clothes back to her house. "No, it's okay," Jane said quickly. "You've already been working all day." "I insist," Daniel replied. "You've done enough for one day." Reluctantly, Jane agreed, and they walked back to her house together. Along the way, they talked about their lives in the village. Jane spoke of her late parents, who had died when she was a child, leaving her in the care of her aunt. When they reached her house, a sharp voice called out from the doorway, "Jane, what took you so long?" A woman in her 40s, with a stern expression, stood with her hands on her hips. Beside her was a young lady dressed in fine clothes, her face twisted in disdain. "Sorry, Auntie," Jane said, bowing her head. "I was washing clothes at the river." "And who is this?" her cousin Juliet asked, glaring at Daniel. "Another one of your poor friends?" Daniel felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "My name is Daniel. I help Jane carry the clothes." The aunt rolled her eyes. "Well, thank you for your help, but we don't need any more charity. Jane, come inside and start cooking dinner." Jane gave Daniel a small, apologetic smile. "Thank you for helping me." As she disappeared into the house, Daniel stood there for a moment, thinking. It was clear that Jane was treated unfairly in her own home, but despite her situation, she remained humble and kind. That night, as Daniel lay on his mat, he couldn't stop thinking about Jane. She wasn't like the women he had met in the palace or even in the village market. She was genuine, hard-working, and unselfish. For the first time since coming to Umoba, Daniel felt that he might have found what he was looking for. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. If Jane's aunt and cousin were anything like the palace women he had left behind, they wouldn't approve of him. Still, Daniel was determined. He wasn't just looking for love, he was ready to fight for it. Daniel had grown used to being dismissed. He had learned to laugh off the insults, but deep down, he still longed for someone who could see past his humble job and appreciate his character, and he thought Jane might be the one. About 3 days later, while he was delivering palm wine to Jane's house, when he met Juliet sitting outside, surrounded by friends, laughing loudly as she admired her reflection in a small mirror. "Good afternoon," Daniel greeted politely, balancing the pot of palm wine on his shoulder. Juliet glanced at him briefly and wrinkled her nose. "What is this?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're the one Papa Obina sent. Look at you. You're dirty and look like you haven't bathed in days." Her friends laughed loudly, and one of them whispered, "Imagine Juliet speaking to someone like him." Jane, who was sweeping the yard nearby, looked up and smiled warmly. She walked over to help Daniel with the pot. "Thank you for bringing the palm wine," she said kindly. "Let me help you put it down and get you a cup of water." Daniel noticed the difference immediately. Juliet barely acknowledged him, and when she did, it was only to insult him. Jane, however, treated him with respect and kindness. "Thank you," Daniel said softly to Jane, ignoring Juliet's mocking laughter. He bowed slightly and left, but the encounter stayed on his mind. Over the next few weeks, Daniel found more reasons to visit Juliet's house, though it wasn't Juliet he wanted to see. He began to notice little things about Jane: how she worked tirelessly to keep the house clean, how she was kind to the children who played nearby, and how she always greeted everyone with a smile, even when she was tired. One evening, as Daniel was strolling along the village path, he saw Jane struggling to carry a large bundle of firewood. He quickly ran to help her. "Let me take that," he said, lifting the bundle off her shoulders. Jane looked surprised but grateful. "Thank you," she said. "You're very kind." "It's nothing," Daniel replied. "You shouldn't have to carry this all by yourself." As they walked, they talked. Jane told Daniel about her life. "My aunt and Juliet mean well," she said, "but sometimes it's hard living here. They expect a lot from me." Daniel listened quietly, his respect for Jane growing with every word. Despite her hardships, she remained humble and cheerful. She didn't complain or blame anyone for her situation. As the days passed, Daniel and Jane grew closer. Whenever Daniel finished his palm wine tapping for the day, he would often find an excuse to pass by Jane's house or the riverbank where she washed clothes. Their conversations were always simple but meaningful, filled with laughter and honest exchanges. One afternoon, as they sat under the shade of a mango tree, Jane shared her dreams with Daniel. "I've always wanted to learn how to sew," she said, her eyes lighting up. "If I could save enough money to buy a sewing machine, I could start a business making clothes." Daniel admired the way her face lit up when she spoke about her dreams. "That's a wonderful idea, Jane," he said. "I believe you can do it." Jane smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in her expression. "It's hard," she admitted. "With all the housework and my aunt's expectations, there's never time for myself. But one day, I'll try." Daniel admired her strength. Despite the struggles she faced, Jane remained hopeful and determined. Her humility and kindness only deepened his respect and affection for her. The villagers began to notice the time Daniel and Jane spent together, and it didn't take long for gossip to spread. "Have you seen how Jane is always with Daniel?" one woman whispered at the market. "They're just friends," another replied. "What could she possibly see in a poor palm wine tapper? She should focus on finding someone better." The comments didn't stop at the market. Villagers mocked Jane openly, calling her foolish for spending time with someone as insignificant as a local palm wine tapper. But Jane never let their words sway her. One day, Jane was walking to the stream together with her friend Adana. Adana decided to confront Jane directly. "Jane, do you really think Daniel is good enough for you? He climbs trees all day and smells of palm wine." Jane stood tall and replied, "Daniel is a hard-working and kind man. That's more important to me than what people think or say. I know his value, even if you don't." One evening, as Daniel was walking Jane back to her house, they were about to say goodbye when Jane's cousin, Juliet, appeared. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at Daniel. "You again," she said with a sneer. "Why are you always hanging around here? Don't you have palm trees to climb?" "I'm just helping," Daniel said evenly, refusing to let her rudeness affect him. Juliet rolled her eyes. "We don't need your help. Jane, stop bringing useless people here. Go inside and cook." Daniel clenched his fists but held his tongue, not wanting to escalate the situation. Jane, however, stepped forward. "Daniel isn't useless," she said firmly. "He's been kinder to me than most people I know." Juliet scoffed. "Kind? What can kindness do for you? You need to focus on real things like money and respect, not wasting time with people like him." Jane's face burned with anger, but she didn't argue further. She turned to Daniel and gave him an apologetic smile. "Thank you for walking me home," she said softly. "Any time," Daniel replied. tipping his head before walking away. Juliet's mocking voice trailed after him, but he ignored it, focusing instead on Jane's quiet strength. Juliet, however, wasn't done. Over the following days, she began pretending to be sweet and kind towards Daniel, not because she liked him, but because she was, hoping to shift his attention from Jane, as she doesn't like seeing her cousin happy. She would go out of her way to speak to him when he delivered palm wine, offering compliments and trying to make small talk. "You work so hard, Daniel," she said one day, her tone unnaturally sweet. "It must take a lot of strength to climb those trees. I really admire that." Daniel thanked her politely, but felt uneasy. Juliet's compliments felt forced, unlike Jane's genuine conversations. Still, Juliet didn't stop there. She also began bad-mouthing Jane to Daniel whenever she got the chance. One evening, as Daniel passed by their house, Juliet called him over. "I need to warn you about something," she said in a low voice. "I've been hearing people talk about you and my cousin Jane. You should be careful. Jane isn't as innocent as she seems." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Juliet sighed dramatically. "She's always pretending to be kind, but she's just trying to get sympathy. You don't know her like I do. I grew up with her, and trust me, she's not the person you think she is." Daniel didn't respond immediately, but Juliet's words lingered in his mind. He knew Juliet was probably just making things up, but he still felt uneasy and decided to ask about her. He remembered Papa Obina's advice: "Watch how they treat people who can do nothing for them." He thought about how Jane treated the children who played around her house, the way she cared for her aunt even when she was treated unfairly, and the way she defended him to the villagers. Jane's actions proved her true nature, no matter what Juliet said. One evening, as Daniel sat with Papa Obina, he shared his thoughts. "Papa, I'm confused. Juliet says things about Jane, and from what I have seen with my own eyes, I know they are probably made-up lies. I just want to ask, since I am still fairly new in this village. But I've seen how Jane lives, how she acts. She's always kind." Papa Obina chuckled knowingly. "My boy, you're learning a hard truth. Some people will say anything to bring others down, but actions never lie. If you trust what you've seen with your own eyes, you'll know the truth." Daniel nodded, his mind clearer. He decided to trust his instincts and focus on what mattered, Jane's genuine heart. He resolved not to let Juliet's manipulations distract him from what he felt was real. Word of Jane and Daniel's growing closeness reached her aunt's ears, fueled by the relentless gossip of the villagers. The news made her furious. She couldn't bear the idea of Jane, whom she saw more as a servant than family, forming a bond with a poor palm wine tapper. One evening, as Jane returned home, her aunt confronted her. "What is this I'm hearing about you and that palm wine tapper?" her aunt demanded, her voice sharp. Jane lowered her eyes. "We're just friends, Auntie." "Friends?" her aunt scoffed. "I won't have you ruin this family's reputation by being seen with someone like him. Do you know what people are saying? It's shameful." Jane opened her mouth to speak, but her aunt cut her off. "Enough. If you don't stop this nonsense, I'll marry you off Mazi Okafor. At least that will bring respect to this family." Jane's heart sank. She knew exactly what her aunt meant. For years, her aunt had been turning away suitors who came asking for her hand, hoping they would shift their attention to Juliet instead. Jane's cousin was always dressed in fine clothes and treated like royalty, while Jane was left to do all the housework. Now her aunt was threatening to use marriage as a punishment, as Mazi Okafor was a 75-year-old man who already had 4 wives. Jane didn't know how to respond, and she felt helpless and tied. Meanwhile, Daniel was determined to speak to Jane. He had been thinking about her constantly and wanted her to know how he felt. That evening he found her sitting alone by the riverbank, her eyes filled with worry. "Jane," Daniel said softly as he approached. She looked up, surprised but glad to see him. "Daniel," she replied, "what are you doing here?" "I wanted to talk to you. It's been so hard to see you as you are always busy with house chores," he said, sitting beside her. "There's something I need to tell you." Jane nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Since I came to this village, I've met many people," Daniel began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But you're different, Jane. You're kind, hardworking, and strong. I admire you more than anyone I've ever met. I think I've fallen in love with you." Jane's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she said nothing, and Daniel feared he had spoken too soon. But then she smiled shyly. "I feel the same way, Daniel. The times I spend with you are the priceless times where I am truly happy," she admitted. "But I'm scared, Daniel. My aunt, she'll never accept us. She is already threatening me." Daniel's heart swelled with both joy and concern. "Do you not care that I'm poor? That I'm just a local palm wine tapper who doesn't have much to offer?" Jane shook her head. "I don't care about those things, Daniel. You're kind and hardworking, and that's what matters to me. We'll work hard together. I can also work and ensure we never lack, no matter what. I believe in you." Her words touched Daniel deeply. He admired her even more for her honesty and willingness to see beyond his humble circumstances. At that moment, he felt a pang of guilt for keeping his true identity away from her. But it was all worth it, he thought to himself. "Thank you, Jane," he said finally after a long pause, his voice filled with gratitude. "I promise I'll do whatever it takes to make you happy." Determined to take the next step, Daniel decided to approach Jane's aunt and formally ask for her hand in marriage. The next evening he arrived at their house, carrying a small pot of fresh palm wine as a gift. Jane's aunt greeted him with a scowl. "What do you want?" she asked, her arms crossed. "I'm here to speak with you about Jane," Daniel said respectfully. "I want to ask for her hand in marriage." Jane's aunt's eyes widened and then she laughed mockingly. "You? A poor palm wine tapper, a local orphan. But then again, you both deserve each other. Poverty attracts poverty. Do you even know what it means to marry into this family?" "I know I may not have much," Daniel said evenly, "but I love Jane, and I'll work hard to take care of her." Her aunt's expression turned cold. "If you want to marry Jane, you'll have to pay the bride price first, and it won't be cheap." She quickly listed an extravagant number of items. Several bags of rice, dozens of yams, fine clothes, jewelry, and a large sum of money. The list was clearly designed to discourage Daniel. Jane, who had been listening from inside the house, stepped out. "Auntie, that's too much," she protested. "Why are you asking for so much?" "Silence," her aunt snapped. "You have no say in this. If he wants to marry you, he'll have to prove he's worthy." Daniel clenched his fists but kept his voice calm. "I'll bring everything you've asked for," he said firmly. "I love Jane, and I'll do whatever it takes to make her my wife." Her aunt stared at him, momentarily stunned. She had expected him to walk away, defeated. Instead, he stood tall and resolute, his determination unwavering. "Fine," she said at last. "Bring the bride price, and then we'll talk." As Daniel left, Jane followed him and caught up with him a few blocks away from their humble home. "Daniel, you don't have to do this. She's trying to make it impossible for you." Daniel smiled at her. "I don't care how hard it is. You're worth it, Jane. I'll find a way." That night, Daniel knew he had to go back. After receiving the marriage list from Jane's aunt, Daniel walked away determined. He kept his calm demeanor, but deep inside, he knew that the time had come to reveal who he truly was. The list was intentionally impossible for someone in his position as a humble palm wine tapper, if only they knew his real identity. He smiled at the thought of him. Daniel packed his few belongings and quietly left the village, heading back to the palace he had left 6 months ago. When he arrived, the guards at the palace gates could hardly recognize him. Gone were the tattered clothes of a palm wine tapper. Daniel had returned as the prince he was. At the palace, Daniel explained everything to his parents, the life he had lived in the village, the people he had met, and how he had fallen in love with Jane. King Henry and Queen Isabella listened intently, their expressions a mix of surprise and admiration. "But it has only been 6 months since you left," Queen Isabella said, astonished. "You've already found the woman you want to marry." "Yes, mother," Daniel replied, and his voice steady. "Jane is the one. She didn't care that I was poor or that I worked as a palm wine tapper. When others mocked me or treated me like a nuisance, She was kind and treated me with respect. She loved me for who I was, despite believing that I was poor and had nothing to offer." The king nodded thoughtfully. "And you're certain about this, Daniel?" "I've never been more certain of anything," Daniel said firmly. "Jane is everything I've been looking for, kind, hardworking, and strong. She stood by me when others wouldn't, and I know she'll make a wonderful queen." Hearing this, Queen Isabella smiled. "Then you have our blessing, my son. Go and bring her back to the palace." King Henry placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You've done well, Daniel. You followed your heart and found a woman of true character. We are proud of you." With his parents' support, Daniel wasted no time preparing for his return to the village. The royal treasurer was summoned to gather the items on the marriage list: bags of rice, yams, fine clothes, gold jewelry, and a generous amount of money. The palace was abuzz with activity as servants loaded everything onto carriages. Daniel's convoy was prepared, complete with royal guards and a band of trumpeters. The day Daniel returned to Umuba, the entire village was thrown into a frenzy. Villagers gathered along the dirt road as the sound of trumpets announced the arrival of the royal entourage. People peeked out of their homes, whispering in shock as they saw the golden carriages, the guards in polished armor, and the elaborate gifts being carried through the streets. "Who is this?" one villager asked. "It's Daniel," another exclaimed, "but he looks like a prince." When the procession stopped in front of Jane's house, her aunt and cousin Juliet rushed outside, their jaws dropping in disbelief. Daniel stepped out of the largest carriage, dressed in fine royal robes and a golden crown resting lightly on his head. Jane appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with surprise. "Daniel?" she whispered. Daniel smiled warmly and walked toward her, taking her hand. "Yes, Jane," he said. "This is who I truly am. I am Prince Daniel of Zuria Kingdom, but everything I told you before, about my love for you, about how I admire your kindness and strength, that was the truth." The villagers gasped as Daniel knelt before Jane, holding out a glittering ring. "Jane," he said, his voice steady, "I came to this village to find someone who would love me for who I am, not for my title or wealth. I found that in you. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Jane's eyes as she nodded. "Yes, Daniel," she said. "I will marry you." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Villagers who had once mocked Daniel for being poor and lowly now looked at him with awe and respect. Jane's aunt and Juliet, however, stood frozen in shock and humiliation. Jane's aunt quickly recovered from her disbelief and attempted to curry favor with Daniel. "Your Highness," she said, bowing deeply, "I had no idea who you were. Please forgive me if I seemed harsh before. I only wanted the best for Jane." Daniel turned to her, his expression calm but firm. "I'm not here for your approval," he said. "Jane is the best thing in this family, and she's the one who deserves respect." Juliet tried to interject, forcing a smile. "Prince Daniel, we always thought highly of you. We were just surprised by your disguise." Daniel ignored her, turning instead to Papa Obina, who stood at the edge of the crowd with a proud smile on his face. "Papa Obina," Daniel called, walking over to him. "You were the first person to show me kindness when I came to this village. You gave me work, taught me an honest craft, and treated me with respect when no one else did." Papa Obina bowed his head. "It was my pleasure, my prince. I only did what was right." Daniel handed him a small chest filled with gold coins. "This is my gift to you, for all that you've done for me." The old man's hands trembled as he accepted the chest. "Thank you, Your Highness. May your reign be blessed." The day ended with a grand celebration in the village. Daniel and Jane stood together, surrounded by villagers who now admired and respected them both. The once dismissive gossipers whispered excitedly about Jane's fortune, while Juliet and her mother stood off to the side, their faces red with humiliation. As the sun set, Daniel looked into Jane's eyes. "You believed in me even when others doubted," he said. "Now I promise to stand by you no matter what." Jane smiled, her heart full. "And I will do the same, Daniel." Hand in hand, they walked into their future together, a union built on love, trust, and the strength of their shared journey. The journey from Umulba to the palace was a dreamlike experience for Jane. As she rode beside Daniel in the royal carriage, she marveled at the golden roads leading to the grand palace gates. Villagers and passers-by waved at them, cheering for the prince and his bride-to-be. Jane couldn't help but feel a mixture of awe and nervousness. When they arrived at the palace, King Henry and Queen Isabella were waiting at the grand entrance, their regal figures framed by the towering palace doors. Jane hesitated for a moment, unsure of how she would be received, but Daniel gently took her hand and led her forward. "Father, mother," Daniel said proudly, "this is Jane, the woman I've chosen to be my wife." The Queen stepped forward, a warm smile spreading across her face. She took Jane's hands in hers. "Welcome, my dear," she said. "Daniel has told us so much about you. Your kindness, strength, and humility are virtues we admire greatly." Jane bowed her head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said softly. The king nodded, his expression approving. "You've won the heart of our son, not because of riches or appearances, but because of who you are. That speaks volumes about your character. We are honored to have you join our family." Jane's eyes glistened with tears. Their acceptance eased her nerves, and she felt truly welcomed into the royal family. The palace staff bustled with excitement as preparations began for the wedding. Invitations were sent across the kingdom, and the finest decorators transformed the palace grounds into a breathtaking venue. For Jane, it felt like a whirlwind, being fitted for elegant gowns, meeting royal advisors, and learning palace customs. But through it all, Daniel stayed by her side, ensuring she felt comfortable and supported. The wedding day arrived, with the kingdom abuzz with celebration. Guests from far and wide filled the palace grounds, eager to witness the union of their beloved prince and his new bride. Jane walked down the aisle in a gown of shimmering gold and white, her heart pounding as she saw Daniel waiting for her at the altar, his eyes filled with love and pride. The ceremony was grand, yet heartfelt. As Daniel and Jane exchanged vows, the crowd cheered, moved by the genuine love between them. The festivities that followed were lavish, with music, dancing, and feasting lasting late into the night. As Jane settled into her new role as a princess, leaving her wicked aunt and jealous cousin behind, the people of Zuria Kingdom grew to adore her. Despite her new status, she remained humble and kind, often visiting the villages to help those in need. Her story inspired many, proving that true worth is found in character, not wealth or appearances. Daniel, too, was a changed man. His time in the village had taught him the value of simplicity and sincerity, and he ruled alongside Jane with compassion and wisdom. Together they became a beloved royal couple, admired not just for their positions, but for their dedication to each other and their people. Moral of the story: true love is based on character, not wealth or appearance. Daniel's journey to find someone who loved him for who he truly was showed that the greatest treasures are found in humility, kindness, and sincerity. Jane's strength and goodness proved that love can thrive when built on trust and mutual respect, creating a bond that no obstacle can break.